I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Alison Evans, who is the Director General of Evaluation at the Independent Evaluation Group, IG, in the bank. This is an event that we're co-sponsoring with the Sustainable Development Practice Group, with the Urban Global Practice. And let me really quick introduce Alison, who is going to give us a few opening remarks. So Alison joined us in IG in January 2019, and before that, she was the Chief Commissioner of the UK's Independent Commission for Aid Impact. Prior to that, she was Executive Director of the Overseas Development Institute, which is the UK's leading international development think tank. So over to you, Alison.
Thank you very much. Really great to see you all here, and particularly nice to have an event like this in person, and also to be amongst such a distinguished panel of speakers. So I don't think anyone here needs convincing that the risk of disasters linked to natural hazards are incredibly real, whether that is unprecedented flooding, earthquakes, drought, heat, or cold. These hazards have always been with us, but are now well understood to be intensified in scale and severity by climate change. The recent unprecedented and tragic flooding in Pakistan offers especially stark evidence of the intensified threat from natural hazards. Natural hazards may occur anywhere, but the loss of life and livelihood associated with them is significantly magnified and disproportionately felt in low-income countries and in those geographies already vulnerable to the multiplying stresses and shocks associated with global heating. Mitigating the risks of these disasters is critical for saving lives and livelihoods, and we need to do that now. But we also need to build resilience and well-being in the face of future shocks. And the good news is that investments to reduce the risk of disaster from natural hazards do work and can deliver clear dividends for people and economies. Evidence confirms that investments in resilient infrastructure have a strong positive net present value for every dollar invested. When countries rebuild infrastructure after disasters to be more resilient, it can reduce the impact of future disasters by as much as 30%. Yet, between 2010 and 2019, only around 4% of global overseas development assistance was linked to disaster work and was linked toward prevention and preparedness for disasters coming from natural hazards. And this, of course, reflects in part the many competing priorities for ODA and the many competing priorities bearing down on already impossibly overstretched government budgets. So how can these priorities be reconciled in favour of urgent action for disaster risk reduction? And how can the case for scaling up the support be made convincingly? A recent evaluation undertaken by my group, the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group, examined a decade's worth of World Bank support for reducing disaster risks caused by natural hazards to inform the World Bank's scale-up of its support to climate change adaptation. And the evaluation finds that the World Bank has a strong track record of building the necessary evidence of risks, on costs, on benefits to influence the uptake of disaster risk reduction by borrowing countries. It also finds that disaster risk reduction is everyone's business, and that World Bank investments made better progress when focused on ministries of finance and critical line ministries rather than disaster agencies alone. And on that note, I'm glad to see Minister Tonela joining us today to join the discussion from the perspective of a Ministry of Finance. The evaluation evidence also confirms the importance of sustained engagement and finding the right entry points to move from an approach emphasising response and reconstruction to one emphasising mitigation and reduction of disaster risks for the longer term. But most relevant of all for today's discussion, the evaluation also found evidence of the power of moving beyond isolated project interventions to put countries on a pathway towards more transformative change. And this requires doing the hard work of strengthening institutional capacities, of designing and putting in place new policies, and building a systemic approach, often using multiple instruments and interventions to building resilience across critical infrastructure and service delivery. This is no small agenda, but one that ultimately pays off in saved lives and more resilient, climate-compatible livelihoods. And this is what we're here to talk about today. Thank you so much for joining us, and now I'm going to pass back to Carmen to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for setting up the stage so nicely. And now, before we go into the panel discussion, I would like for all of us to take a few minutes to watch a very short video that it really shows the challenge of what disaster is imposing in all of us, but it also shows some outstanding efforts that we have been doing.
In the last 4 decades, more than 2.4 million lives and over $3.7 trillion have been lost to disasters caused by natural hazards. Over 90% of these deaths occurred in lower-income countries. And each year, disasters from natural hazards cause over $300 billion in new losses. Climate change is accelerating the intensity of natural hazards and is threatening to push an additional 100 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. To face this challenge, the World Bank is working with governments to transform how we identify, prepare for, respond to, and recover from natural hazards. A recent major evaluation found in the last 10 years, the World Bank, strongly supported by GFDRR, tripled its support for disaster risk reduction and approved billions of dollars of investments in over 1,000 projects across 100 countries. In Mozambique, tropical storms destroyed an average of 500 classrooms per year. The World Bank worked with the government to develop resilient school classroom designs for new builds and existing structures, and supported the construction of resilient school buildings across the country, providing more than 3,700 storm-resilient classrooms.
Eu, como encarregada de educação, para além de ser professora, eu sinto segura em mandar meus filhos a estudarem nessa escola e sinto segura como professora em receber alunos, em dar aula.
In the Philippines, a new integrated flood management system will protect the 13.5 million residents of Manila. And across the country, the capacity building program, Ready to Rebuild, has helped communities and local governments to be more resilient and to respond and recover from disasters.
Government efforts need to look into how they can mainstream risk reduction, climate change adaptation into their development planning.
In Bihar, India's most flood-prone state, 76 million people face recurring flood threats. The World Bank support led to 70 kilometers of embankments in the Kochi River Basin and a new forecasting and early warning system enabling vulnerable people to evacuate before floods hit.
ये सब जब बना है तो वो रिकवरी ऑफ लैंड भी हुआ, एग्रीकल्चर इम्प्रूव किया, कमर्शियल एक्टिविटीज़ इम्प्रूव किया, तो धीरे धीरे लोगों का लाइफ नॉर्मल हुआ इस चीज़.
Financing disaster risk reduction saves lives and livelihoods. The Independent Evaluation Group report shows clear evidence of the life-saving impact, but also signals the urgent need for scaling up our efforts in all regions and across all sectors, leaving no one behind. How can we work together to build long-term resilience, support the most vulnerable, and help our world to adapt and thrive?
Wow, fantastic video. I hope you're inspired and ready for the panel discussion now. And I'm going to start with a question to Dr. Andrew Steer. Many of you might know him from his time in the bank. Dr. Steer is currently the president and the CEO of Bezos Earth Fund. And before that, he was the president and CEO for 8 years of the World Resource Institute. And again, many of you might know him from when he was the World Bank's special envoy for climate change. So as we just saw in the video, the evidence is unfolding right in front of our eyes. Exacerbated by climate change, natural hazards are becoming more severe, putting more people at risk and reversing growth everywhere, but especially in the poorest countries. The natural hazards that we are witnessing and the disasters they cause are very much a sign of a world to come, which is scary. So, Andrew, what will it take for countries and for the international community to be prepared for this new world that is coming?
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Carmen. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Alison, thanks for the work you're doing and the wonderful report that your team wrote. The bank is part of a major shift in the way we think about these issues. I was living in Jakarta as the World Bank country director on the 26th of December 2004 when the tsunami hit. More than 200,000 lives were lost in Aceh. I went up there more than 30 times in the next 18 months. I think we responded as well as we possibly could. But to be absolutely honest, there weren't the expertises that we could call upon. We simply didn't have the professionalism as how to respond. And this was just a response, let alone build back better, so to speak. So I think we did a good job, and I think that actually led to all kinds of progress. But it's a different world now. It's a different world in two senses. One, the capacity that organizations like the World Bank and some of the other organizations have is just much, much richer. Second, of course, the problem is much greater. We won't necessarily have more tsunamis, but we certainly will have more extreme weather events. Climate change didn't cause Hurricane Ian 3 weeks ago, but it almost certainly made it much stronger. Probably was one or two levels of intensity higher. And science can now tell us that. If the water is warmer, if the air is warmer, more water will be absorbed and winds will be stronger. What's true of Florida is tragically true with much greater impact around the world. It's great to have the minister here from Mozambique because the way you're dealing with things is so important in a very difficult case. The Secretary General, I believe, of the United Nations declared the hunger in southern Madagascar as the first truly sort of a demonstrated climate disaster that we've had. So what do we need to do? Well, what we can't do is keep going the way we've been going. We simply will not have the resources to keep responding. I had the privilege of being Director General at DFID when we were responding incredibly generously to disasters as they happen. We simply can't do that because there's going to be a lot more of them. So we've got to do the kind of prevention anticipatory issues. Over the last 10 years, the introduction, for example, of parametric disbursement techniques has been a major breakthrough. But that, if you like, was phase one. That says when the wind reaches a speed of 100 kilometers an hour, we disperse money. That was an incredible breakthrough. The bank was pretty central in that whole thing. That's now fairly standard. We can do much better than that, though. We can go one step further back because we now have the capacity to actually anticipate much more accurately. Think about 3 different time horizons. One is sort of the typhoon or the hurricane. How much do we know? When do we know it? We now know earlier, we know with much more detail, and we're now seeing in countries like Bangladesh astonishing disbursements of funds even before the hurricane even arrives. And that can save 50% of the money and can save 50% of the loss of lives. So we can now disperse funds, we can take action before something even happens. But then there's the next time horizon is, if you like, the El Nino type thing, 2 or 3 years. We now have the capacity of anticipating that with a lot more accuracy. So that means, again, we can get engaged much earlier on. And then the final sort of time horizon we need to understand is the kind of 10 to 30 years, the real climate change effects. And what we can now do through amazing big data, through artificial intelligence, through incredibly sophisticated models that could never be run even 10 years ago, we're able to actually do projections that are all probabilistic, of course, about which of the 15,000 river basins in the world will suffer the biggest impact and what will that impact look like. Now that has a lot of implications if you want to prepare, because you can't afford necessarily to put money everywhere. You can't afford to invest in protection everywhere, but we ought to move towards a system where we can anticipate. We are not doing that now, almost at all. There are a couple of countries, and by the way, it's great to have the Norwegian minister here, because you guys are sort of leading so much on this. And also we're going to hear from the Japanese later on, who wrote the book, or literally, on this subject. But we need to just, we could seize this opportunity just in a much more inspiring way using science. One of the things we're doing at the Bezos Earth Fund, we're bringing together some of the suppliers of technology, of prediction, of projections, the science, together with, if you like, the suppliers of solutions, which are the World Food Programme, the World Bank, Save the Children, a whole range of organizations. And we're saying, would you be interested in demonstrating that actually bringing the very, very best science, that you'd be willing to do things differently? So that's one of the things that we're hoping to be able to do. Great to be here.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think you really set the stage very nicely at the big picture. And you pointed at two important things. You said resources are more limited now than they were before, which pose a challenge for all of us to think out of the box. How do we do things? And that we need to anticipate more. So this is a great segue for bringing here Minister Tonela, because I want to ask him precisely about his experience in Mozambique, doing both limited resources and anticipation. But before I get there, I would like to introduce Minister Tonela to all of you. He started his position in March 2022. And before being Minister of Economy and Finance in Mozambique, he was also the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy from 2017 to 2022, and Minister of Industry and Commerce from January 2015 to December 2017. So Mozambique, and maybe many of you don't know, is considered the third most vulnerable country to disaster risk in Africa. Mozambique has taken comprehensive and strategic action towards disaster risk reduction, as you said, to anticipate it. And they have made, under your leadership, significant investments in key areas to increase their resilience to disasters caused by natural hazards. So could you tell us a little bit, Minister Tonela, about which process do you use, where are the results, and if you could give advice to any minister in other countries how to advance disaster risk reduction, what will that advice be?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to discuss such a vital topic. As you may know, Mozambique is a country that least contribute to the climate change. However, is among the region more exposed to natural hazards. So the increase in frequency and magnitude of cyclones and floods that hit Mozambique, with many loss of lives and also painful damage to public and private infrastructure, causing also food security disruption, are clear evidence that for us the means of climate change is in a very present reality. About 58% of Mozambican population is exposed to at least one meteorological hazard, and more than 37% are exposed to 2 or more hazards. And one of the main challenges we have is the ability to adapt and recover from the multiple effect of natural disasters due to lack of resources. That's why, in our view, there is no other way to go rather than to step for climate change adaptation and build resilience. And we are implementing a series of reforms aimed at improving our capacity to deal with prevention, build resilience, and strengthen social and financial protection against the impact of climate change-related disasters. By the way, for example, our government first approved the National Adaptation and Climate Change Mitigation Strategy almost 10 years ago, and in line with the Sendal framework for disaster risk reduction, the government adopted in 2017 the Master Plan for Disaster Risk Reduction, a strategical instrument that guides policies at all stages of the disaster cycle. In same year, a disaster management fund was created and includes among the fund's revenue scheme allocation of a percentage of the state budget as a contribution from the government, as well as a contribution from private sector and corporation donors. Most recently, the financial protection component was improved with the strengthening of a legal framework and approval of the Disaster Financial Protection Plan in the course of 2022. And within this context, and with support of World Bank, Mozambique has initiated the development of a financial protection agenda against disaster, which includes a risk retention and risk transfer mechanism, such as insurance, and we are at a very advanced stage in contracting the first sovereign insurance package that should be concluded before the end of this year. In addition, we are further exploring opportunities related to contingency loans, which could allow us to rapidly trigger the release of credit in aftermath of a disaster event. Despite our challenges and vulnerability, Mozambique remains fully committed to ensure a better future. And while we are working proactively to mitigate the effects of disasters caused by climate change disaster, we pay special attention to development of renewable and alternative source of energy. There's a few numbers of recommendations we can share with countries trying to advance in the same direction. We first have to take in account that the effects of climate change are not hypothetical future threat, as was mentioned. And in this regard, climate change and disaster reduction are not a choice, but an imperative. And we believe that disaster management requires a number of government action integrated, and it's critical that we understand the risk profile of each country, being also essential to establish an integrated and comprehensive master plan for disaster risk reduction, followed by a financial protection agenda as we are following Mozambique. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you were able to see the big picture, and then we zoom in into the incredible work that Mozambique is doing to have a roadmap how to prevent the disasters. And you talk actually about a disaster risk fund that was created, which is a good segue to bring here now the perspective of a donor. So I would like to bring here Minister Ambeta Schreinerin, Minister of International Development in Norway. I hope I got it a little bit right, the pronunciation. And she's in charge of the UN system, the World Bank, the regional development banks, and other global funds and programs. And in addition, she's the Minister for Nordic Cooperation and responsible for NORAD, NOREC, and NORFAN. So there is a strong evidence of the high return on investment in disaster risk reduction. For example, in resilient infrastructure or on early warning system. But yet, the share of development assistance devoted to disaster risk reduction is still very low. So, what do you think development priorities should be? So how can development priorities shift in the face of a greater risk of disasters as we're seeing from natural hazards?
Thank you, and thank you for convening this meeting and putting this at top of the agenda. I feel that priorities have shifted with most donors. I really feel that. But there is still the issue of financing, and there is the issue of finding smart ways of working and doing this in practice. And the reason why I say that priorities are or have shifted, at least I can say that on behalf of my own country, that is because we see that we are, past achievements are lost, and future development efforts are undermined. Because of natural disasters. So we have been forced to shift our priorities. But in terms of finance, we're moving up to COP27. And I know that many of my colleagues, especially in some African countries, they don't have huge expectations for COP27. And that is a great worry. At least for the Norwegian, speaking for Norway, we have said that we will deliver on doubling our climate finance by 2026. But more importantly, and this is my main point, we want to triple financing for climate adaptation. And we need to push that agenda a lot more among the donors, because financing climate adaptation is fighting poverty. When we talk about financing climate adaptation in practice, we're talking about food security, we're talking about climate smart agriculture, we're talking about saving livelihoods. So poverty reduction and climate adaptation is just two sides of the same coin. Now we have to work differently, and it's easier said than done. Now what we have to do is streamline climate adaptation into all our programs, no matter what topic, what sector we're working on. I think we are getting ahead on that. And what is really helpful, and some of you mentioned it, is that we need to put a price on not adapting, quantifying that cost. And that, we need a model to do that. I'm not an economist. I have no idea how to do it, but I'm sure, people are working on that. And that is very, very helpful. And it's very, very helpful for ministers like me when talking to the ministries of finance, etc. So that's useful. Andrew spoke of science. We have the science here. I'm not so sure that we have the flexibility among the donors to really use the knowledge. And that brings me to Nexus. Because we all agree, and Nexus is such a buzzword, how to connect humanitarian assistance and long-term developments. We all agree to do it, but we haven't really untangled the knot. I just want to urge all my colleagues to work on that flexibility, because we hear it from the actors in the field all the time. The donor said, "Oh yes, of course you're right. We need to provide flexibility, but we don't really do it, or we don't know how to do it." I have one example. Andrew was optimistic and said, "Oh no, we are working differently." Well, there is still a way to go. I was in South Sudan some months ago and spoke to WFP up close to Bor, where they are halfway constructing the dike, making sure that the recurring floods do not enter into the villages. And of course, the flooding is, even in the supposedly dry season, the country, 1/3 of the country is still flooded. Now the WFP says we have to use helicopters to get our food deliveries into the villages. It's extremely expensive. using just a part of that money to finish that dike, it's half finished, we can use the roads all year round. But the donors don't have the flexibility for the money. So, we just have to work differently. We have to step up to the task. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. And you mentioned you're not an economist, but I can tell you we have a lot of economists here at the World Bank. So this is a good segue to bring Bernice into the discussion to tell us about what our economists are funding about this. But also we have GFDRR, which has been doing an amazing job, and that's what our evaluation shows. And I'm a little bit biased because I used to be with Bernice and GFDRR in the urban practice long time ago. But let me introduce Bernice. I think many of you know her. So she's the global director, the current global director for urban disaster risk management. So that's actually the title of our global practice in the bank, resilience and land. And before that, she was the global director for climate change group. So she knows the nexus and she knows very well where disaster fits. Bernice, I wanted to ask you if you can tell us what the bank has been doing to reduce disaster risk and adapt to these changing client needs that we've been talking about and the shifting environment. And also, if you could tell us a little bit where your thoughts are about following up on some of the recommendations of the IEG evaluation, especially in integrating the needs of the populations that are disproportionately vulnerable, as we saw in the video.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Carmen, and thank you for inviting me to this session. First of all, I'm not an economist myself, so I won't go into that one. But we do have indeed a lot of good economists, including in GFDRR, doing a lot of really cutting-edge work. And of course, we've introduced over the last year our country climate and development reports, which are exactly doing that at each country level, looking at what are the economic impacts over the medium and long term of not adapting to climate change and really costing that, so that we can have that conversation with ministries of finance. So we're rolling these out across all of our client countries. So it's exactly the kind of thing that you're looking for. To come back to your question, Carmen, I think Andrew referred to it. When you were country director in Indonesia in 2004, tsunami hit. The bank really didn't have the expertise, though. We did reconstruction. It's in our title, right? IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We forget the R there sometimes, but we did a lot of reconstruction. We really didn't think much about disaster risk reduction or indeed building back better. And I think lessons from obviously major disasters like the Indian Ocean tsunami, the Eastern Japan great earthquake and tsunami, but of course many other disasters, hurricanes in Central America, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Africa region. We've really built our expertise and really started, I think, what we can honestly call a paradigm shift away from post-disaster reconstruction and indeed humanitarian aid to really starting to think ex-ante risk reduction. How can we make, as you were showing in the video, how can we make schools resilient? How can we make our infrastructure resilient? How can we prepare governments like the government of Mozambique to get ready both in terms of making risk reduction of key critical infrastructure, but also in terms of financial instruments. So a lot of thinking about disaster risk finance and insurance, and how can we come up with new instruments that can really help countries deal with the crisis at the moment. So a lot of work. Pleased to say, of course, a lot of that was done with the support of GFDRR. We would not have done it without all of the support from GFDRR and very generous donors who stood behind us. And as a result, as the IEG report showed, we have actually tripled over the last decade, World Bank investments in disaster risk reduction, which is really fantastic. And again, just to go back to your point, Andrew, we had maybe 2-3, if that, disaster risk management specialists in the bank. Today we have 140. It's a professional family. We have them in every region. They work across the globe, and it's really a professional family now that didn't used to exist in the bank. So again, just to highlight that paradigm shift. Having said that, there's still a lot to do, of course, as the IEG report also, we can't sit on our laurels. We've heard a lot about the impacts of climate change. We know it's only going to get worse. We know that the extreme weather events are going to just keep coming at us. So we'll need to be there. There's constant work to keep increasing our mainstreaming of this agenda in other sectors, whether it's in the healthcare sector, you name it. We're really looking at, resilient energy systems, etc. Really trying to mainstream this work. And then some of the other recommendations that the report came out with was really also looking, we need to continue to look at issues of inclusion, for example. No? So whilst a natural disaster is gender neutral, right? In and of itself, the impacts of it are not. No, they are obviously impacted by the gender dynamics in the society where that disaster is happening. So we're doing quite a lot of work around things like early warning systems. Do women have access to early warning systems? Even simple things like the design of a disaster of a shelter. Like if there's no separate bathrooms for women in the shelter or spaces where women can safely stay, you'll find that women don't end up going to the emergency shelters in times of disaster. So it's really a lot of thinking through how we can be more inclusive. Of course, disability comes into that as well. So a lot of work, exciting work, some of it basic things like just the simple design of a shelter, but all the way to how do you ensure that women have title to their land. So after a disaster, they can still, access, they can get, loans, etc. Because they actually can show that they own that property to begin with. So a lot of work around that. And then the other recommendation, and this will be my final, the final thing I just wanted to mention, is a lot of work that we've started in the last few years. Again, going back to that nexus, like how do we work better with what we call our FCV colleagues? No, these are the colleagues working on fragility, conflict, and violence, working in fragile states. What we find is that climate change and natural disasters are sort of often tipping points there, really work as an amplifier of underlying fragility and conflict. So to the extent that we can work in these countries, work together to reduce the disaster risk, will also help with stability and less conflict in the medium and long term. So we're working a lot with them around these issues. And on a very practical level, we have a lot of tools that we've developed in the disaster risk management practice over the last decade that are also very applicable when you're working in a fragile context. So again, there's a lot of overlap and really a lot of space for us to keep working together, and certainly a lot to be done as we move forward to the next 10 years. So thank you.
Thank you, Bernice, for the insights and also very clear guidance and a strategy of what the bank is planning to do. As you said, we need to remain positive, but there is still a lot to do, right? It's a huge challenge. So now what I like to do is to open it up for questions, because I'm sure you are all very curious. You have seen the big picture. You have seen how it works in a country in Africa. What is the perspective of the donor? What the bank is doing? So please, if you have questions, come to the microphone. If you don't mind, to introduce yourself, and also if you know to who you want to pose the question to mention it. So,
hi, I had a question for Mozambique in terms of the insurance, sovereign insurance. Does that include any portfolios of catastrophe bonds, and what are you doing there?
And again, if you don't mind to introduce yourself, so we also know who you are. Thank you.
My name's Bianca Taylor. I'm partner at a climate a consulting firm at the cross-section of climate, finance, and policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Douglas Glendon. I'm a lead evaluation specialist at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. My question actually goes to anyone who chooses to sort of pick up on it. The context is that just for any major issue, budgets related to prevention always pale in comparison to budgets for treatment, just a drop in the bucket. And when there are big catastrophes, I think COVID, pandemic response, there's always a big push to increase the sort of prevention funding. And then when things are okay, when big catastrophes don't happen, when the problem is reduced, funding tends to shift back toward treatment. Those budgets get slashed quickly. So we're talking here about scaling up action on disaster risk reduction. But maybe the next question is, after scaling up and assuming that we can solve some of these issues related to working across the nexus and increasing flexibility of making the funds available in the right time to support prevention, assuming that works, what's the next step to sustaining that so that those funds don't get slashed and then go back to a responsive style of operating? Thank you.
Wow, that is a great question. I think everybody probably wants to answer a little bit part of that big question. So why don't we start with the first one? Minister Tonela, if you could take it, and then if you want also to give an answer to this one, and then we'll go to Bernice, to Andrew, and to Ambeta. Yeah?
Yes, thank you very much. As I mentioned, we started recently to implement the new financial protection agenda against the disasters by study the risk profile of Mozambique. We are focused on droughts as well as cyclones, whereby we have windy and floods, and taking into consideration the risk that we evaluate. We are taking steps to mitigate for the next rainy season. So we are not taking bonds as our option now. It will be the first insurance program that we are implementing. Perhaps in the future we might also take into consideration that option. Okay, thank you.
Sure, so maybe I can, a couple of thoughts on your question. So, I mean, there's a lot of evidence, of course. Now we have plenty of studies. I mean, I don't know, there's hundreds of studies, I think, that show that every dollar invested in disaster risk prevention gives you, $6 to $10 in avoided losses. No, so again, the economic case is very clear, and of course, we do that, and then we do these studies also at the country level to really kind of highlight, why it makes sense to be investing your scarce resources in disaster risk reduction, in prevention, in early warning systems, to have all of these avoided losses in the future. It's easier said than done. Resources are scarce. When there's a humanitarian disaster unfolding, it's imperative that we step up, that you respond. I mean, so there's always going to be that tension. What we have found, I think, operationally, again, I think in this last decade, is that when a natural disaster occurs, whether it's an earthquake or it's a climate-related disaster, it's actually a great moment to start talking about longer-term adaptation and longer-term investment in risk reduction. So that's often been where we really start getting traction with this agenda with governments. And then maybe the last point is, I think it's also critical, coming back to what we've been saying, that whatever we do these days in a sort of post-disaster response and reconstruction mode has to be built back better. We have to do that. We have to use the latest science, the latest information, the latest modeling that we have in terms of the risk exposure, so that when we build back better, when we rebuild, that we that we address these risks, not just today's risks, but also future climate risks. So, and I would say, for instance, now we have a huge team in Pakistan who's doing, post-disaster needs assessment. They're looking at, all of the impacts of the floods, but they're already starting to think very much about, our support to Pakistan in their reconstruction to these massive floods right now is all going to be already through a lens of how do we prevent the future, disasters from happening. So, sorry, let me stop there. Thanks, Carmen.
I agree very much with Bernice that we need to convey the astonishing returns that come from this, and we need to simplify things. I mean, part of us is our problem. We tend to make things too complicated, and a lot of ministers, not you, Anne, but a lot of ministers will say, "I don't get it. I know how to do renewable energy, or I know how to do a jobs program, but I mean, what is all this? Little bits and pieces of adaptation. It's all so complicated. And the adaptation community, you know, and I take partly the blame for this along with others, says, well, it's all very location specific. You know, you can't generalize. Well, then what can you do? So what you need to say is, you know, I moved to Hanoi in 1997 as a country director of the World Bank. And the first month we had a typhoon. 3,000 people died, most of them fishermen who had no knowledge the weather was even coming, and others in low-lying areas. Today, instead of killing 3,000 people, they estimate that less than 10 would lose their lives. Why? Because now every fishing boat has a radio, tells you when things are coming, and the breakthrough was, which we were part of, there are no schools now in the low-lying areas that don't have two floors. And by the way, they have ramps up so you can even take your goat and your donkey, or water buffalo is a bit too heavy. But so you know that comes to life. You know, when Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, when she was at the bank, you know, we started the Adaptation Commission because we felt that there wasn't a narrative the way there was on mitigation. There wasn't a link to the economy. And somebody in the press conference said to her, you know, it's so complicated. What is it? And she said, but it's not really. I was in Bangladesh last month, and adaptation is, you don't have chickens, you have ducks, i.e. it's going to flood. Better to have someone that can swim, you know. And so that, oh, wow, it's actually not so complicated. But I mean, more seriously, I mean, there is now an emerging set of information that can really inform this. And we have to move away from what, for most of my career, most of the World Bank's career, when we talk about economic development, we just focus on the return, we don't focus on managing risk. If you run a big fund, you don't just try and maximize return, you maximize return subject to having a resilient portfolio. We have not done that in the development profession. And we need to be much, much more professional about this. And maybe at times, maybe you'll have temporarily a little less growth, but my goodness me, you'll have a much, much more prosperous future. So we need that mindset change. And I think the way you put it, Anne, was brilliant. We've got to remind people of the cost of not adapting. And you know, I think you're playing the role along with other ministers. We've just got to raise the temperature on this issue. I mean, it's striking, isn't it? You think that yesterday or the day before, we had the shocking Russian attacks. Today, every defense minister is sitting, discussing it in wherever it is, Geneva or wherever they are, you know, including the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. He went overnight. Exactly. Why? It's that important. Where is that kind of level of attention, given we are 4 weeks away from COP27, for heaven's sake, and it's heading towards a mixed outcome at best? And your story was terrific about the you know, if only you could finish that. Now, in every country, I'm sure they have donor groups working with the government, but most of those donor groups don't have people in them that can make decisions. They have to go back to headquarters, and you have to go back to the World Bank, and my goodness me, we'd have to go to the board, we'd have to, you know, get the lawyers involved and so on. Well, good luck then. We won't ever be able to respond the way we need to. We've got to have a totally different way of thinking about things. So let's do it.
You know, God bless you, Andrew, for at least reminding us that there are some improvements. You know, there are, yeah. Just an observation as a politician from Europe, because I thought the question on sustainability in financing for preparedness, that was a great question. But just an observation, I mean, we haven't been really good at prioritizing that in Europe or the US either. I mean, at least in my country, it's been a struggle because we've had this kind of a roll-on, roll-off principle that, you know, we just fix the problem when it arrives. We haven't been good at preparing or at prevention at all. But I think we are realizing that we missed out on something, because all of a sudden climate crises are occurring more often on our continent as well. And we are in the midst of a war, and oh my God, all of a sudden we realize that the logistics of international trade is not working. So it's like, oh, maybe we have to start talking about preparedness. So let's hope it rubs off into the way we think financing for development as well.
Great. So on that note, I know you wanted to ask a question, but if I could ask you, maybe when we finish, you could ask then, because I know we need to wrap it up in the next 5 minutes. So if you don't mind to stay afterwards, thank you so much. So on that note, I want to invite now Vice Minister Kentaro Ogata-san, Deputy Vice Minister for International Affairs in the Ministry of Finance in Japan. He's in that post since July 2021, after serving as the Director of Planning and Administration and after serving as Director of International Organizations in the International Bureau. Thank you, Ogata-san.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm quite honored to closing this important event. First of all, let me say that we are so pleased that the IEG report have found that the World Bank has a strong track record in assisting the vulnerable countries to take actions on disaster risk reductions. We are proud that such achievement was supported by GFDRR and also the Japan World Bank program for mainstreaming the disaster risk management in developing countries. The Japan has focused in this area, as Japan itself has long been exposed to natural hazards and their compounded risks. Just this past summer, we went through extreme heat, as in many other places, and it happened during the surge in the COVID-19 cases. And the typhoons brought winds and floods and the landslides. And of course, we never forget the powerful earthquake followed by the devastating tsunami 11 years ago, which took many lives and destroyed livelihoods. So we know the heartache of losing everything to disasters. And we have ingrained in our culture the importance of building resilience to calamities. So if our sad experience could be useful to others, we would be happy to and very eager to share our expertise. Knowledge sharing is very important, as pointed out. So we are so grateful that the bank effectively assisted us to help others through our strong partnership through the GFDRR. I'm sure that all of you know quite well at the GFDRR, but the GFDRR has been advancing disaster resilience through advocacy and knowledge sharing and operational initiatives. And many of those activities have been funded through the Japan World Bank Program for Mainstreaming Disaster Risk Management, which was established in 2014 under the management and leadership of the GFDRR. The program, as the name indicates, supports the bank client countries to mainstream disaster risk management, international development planning, and investment projects. Japan is also honored to host the World Bank's Disaster Risk Management Hub in Tokyo. So we have achieved quite a bit through these initiatives. However, as the IEG report notes, much more needs to be done. And the title of today's event shows we need scaling up. The current world is facing multiple overlapping crises. We see climate change, of course, the COVID-19 and conflict, inflation, rising debt, and food insecurities. These global challenges are all particularly impacting the most vulnerable. To make it worse, the past few years have clearly illustrated that the systemic nature of the risks spreading from health to economic systems and to global well-being. Under this severe environment, sustainable development and adaptation have become much harder to achieve. So we need globally coordinated response and integrated and comprehensive action, as Minister Tonela mentioned. And I believe that the IDA 20, which means that the 20th replenishment of IDA, is a key example. As noted by the IEG report, again, the IDA is a key vehicle in helping enhance the bank's support for disaster risk reduction. The IDA's priority areas cover comprehensive development agendas, including enhancing resilience to natural hazards, responding to COVID-19 pandemic, and strengthening health system, including through universal health coverage. These priorities resonate quite well with the Japan's own priorities. This historic $93 billion replenishment truly signal, I believe, the global solidarity in solving concurrent crises. Japan is very proud to have hosted the launch event of the IDA 20 last month in Tokyo. So we, the international community, have the responsibility, and arguably we also have a unique opportunity to support developing countries and the necessary investments now that lay the foundation for sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery that leaves no one behind, including women, persons with disabilities, and those in fragile and conflict-affected situations. We need to keep improving our assistance. So today's event has provided great insights. It is also timely that the next year marks the midpoint in implementing the Sendai framework to address disaster risks. Japan, once again, is committed to working with the World Bank, GFDR, and our partners around the globe to support developing countries enhance preparedness by strengthening their emergency response capabilities to manage large and multiple compounding risks. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to working closely with you on this important global endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ogata-san. And this has been an incredible event. I hope you all learned something new. And again, we all, as you said, we just need to get to work on this, Andrew, to scale up action. Please join me in a big applause to all of the panel members, to Alison and Ogata-san.